The sun hung low over the New Mexico territory, stretching long shadows across the barren land as Clara Hayes trudged beside the wagon that no longer had a driver. The horse that pulled it was tired, ribs showing through its chest, and Clara felt much the same. 3 days earlier, she had been a married woman with dreams of starting a new life farther west. 3 days earlier, her husband, Everett, had been alive, full of plans, full of promises, full of hope. Now all she had was the dust, the silence, and a grief that felt heavier than the wagon behind her. Ever since the raid, Clara had moved without direction, relying solely on instinct and the will to survive. Everett had fallen protecting her, and the small group of settlers they'd been traveling with had fled in fear. She had been left alone. Alone with her sorrow, alone with a wagon half burned, alone with a desert that cared nothing for suffering. She would have died there if not for the memory of Everett urging her to keep walking, keep breathing, keep fighting. By the fourth evening, Clara's strength was nearly gone. Her lips cracked, her dress torn, her nerves raw. She set up a small fire beside the wagon and curled up beneath a blanket too thin for the cold desert night. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance, and every sound sent her heart into her throat. She had barely slept when she sensed movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the flicker of her firelight. Her breath caught. At first, she thought it was another animal. But then she saw it again, tall, silent, human. Clara's entire body tightened. She reached for the small knife Everett had left behind, clutching it with trembling fingers. A man stepped into the firelight, but he did not draw a weapon. His presence was strong yet calm, like a storm held beneath the surface. His long dark hair was tied back, a feather woven into it. His chest bore the markings of battles fought and won. His eyes, deep, unreadable, and steady, studied her without cruelty, without haste. This was no wanderer. This was a leader. "Do not be afraid," he said in a low voice accented with the rhythm of his people. "I mean no harm." Clara swallowed hard, unsure whether to run or drop the knife. Her pulse pounded loud in her ears. Who are you?" "I am Shadowhawk," he said, tapping a hand to his chest. "War Chief of the Red Mesa Apache." Her stomach dropped. Apache. The word itself caused travelers to whisper in fear around campfires. She had heard stories, some true, some exaggerated, about raids, arrows, ambushes. And yet here he stood, not attacking her, not threatening her, but watching her with a strange, measured patience. "Why are you here?" Clara managed to ask. Shadowhawk glanced at her wagon, her torn dress, her sunburned cheeks. "You have been walking alone for many days," he said. "You are weak, hungry, lost." His gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "You should not be alone here. This land is merciless." Clara felt a sting behind her eyes, the thread of tears she refused to let fall. "I have no choice." "You do," he replied quietly. It was then that Clara noticed something tucked beneath his arm, a woven bundle, wrapped carefully in animal hide. Shadowhawk shifted it, revealing a tiny face barely visible in the shadows. A baby, no two babies. Twins, small and fragile. "My daughters," he said, lifting the bundle so she could see. "They were born 2 nights ago." His jaw tightened, and grief flickered briefly across his features. "Their mother died giving them life." Clara's heart twisted. Motherless newborns. 2 of them. And this fierce warrior had walked alone through the night carrying them. Shadowhawk stepped closer, though still leaving distance between them. "My daughters need a wet nurse," he said. "Someone who can feed them, hold them, keep them warm. My tribe has no woman with milk to spare." His eyes locked onto hers, steady as stone. "I offer you shelter, safety, food. You will be honored in my camp. Stay with us for 1 moon, and you may leave freely." Clara stared at him, stunned. The desert wind lifted the edge of her blanket, but she no longer felt the cold. She only felt the weight of the moment. The impossible choice before her to stay meant stepping into an Apache camp, into the unknown. Into the arms of people she had been taught to fear. To refuse meant leaving 2 motherless infants to starve. Slowly, her grip on the knife loosened. She looked at the twins, then at the warrior holding them with surprising gentleness, and she whispered, "I'll go with you." Shadowhawk nodded once, not in triumph, but in gratitude. And with that, Clara Hayes's life took a turn no settler woman ever expected, a path that would lead not to danger, but to a destiny waiting in the heart of the Apache Nation. The journey to the Apache camp began in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of Shadowhawk's footsteps and the soft, occasional whimpers of the newborn twins. Clara walked beside him, each step unsteady but determined. The desert night was colder away from her fire, and the moon cast long silver beams over the rocky ground. She could feel the weight of uncertainty with every breath. Shadowhawk kept a careful distance from her, not wanting to frighten her more than she already was. Yet his presence offered an odd kind of reassurance. For reasons she could not explain, Clara felt safer walking behind an Apache warrior than she had felt alone in the desert. Perhaps it was the babies. Perhaps it was desperation. Or perhaps, beneath his intimidating exterior, Shadowhawk had shown her something she had not expected. Mercy. As they approached a cluster of rock formations, Clara heard voices low, murmuring, almost chanting. Shadows moved between the boulders. The closer she walked, the more shapes emerged from the darkness. Men, women, children, all watching her. All silent, her heart thudded painfully. She felt like an intruder trespassing on sacred ground. Shadowhawk raised a hand, signaling to the watchers that all was well. A woman stepped forward, older, with silver streaks in her braids and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She wore a necklace of carved bone and turquoise. Though no one introduced her, Clara sensed immediately that this was someone of importance. "White woman," the elder said, her tone steady but far from warm. "You bring her here?" "She comes to feed my daughters," Shadowhawk replied calmly. The elder's eyes slid to Clara's. A storm of judgment flickered there. "We do not take strangers easily." Clara swallowed, feeling her cheeks heat beneath the scrutiny. Shadowhawk shifted the twins in his arms. "They will die without her," he said softly. The elder's stern face softened just a fraction as she looked at the babies. After a long silence, she nodded once and stepped aside. The tribe parted, creating a path. Clara followed Shadowhawk into the heart of the camp. It was unlike anything she had imagined. Teepees made from buffalo hides stood in a wide circle. A large fire crackled in the center, casting warm light across the ground. The scent of sage and smoke hung in the air. Men sharpened arrowheads. Women tended boiling pots. Children stared with wide eyes, whispering to one another. Every gaze seemed to land on Clara. She wrapped her arms around herself, wishing she could disappear. She had never felt so foreign or out of place. Shadowhawk led her to a teepee near the back of the camp. "This will be yours," he said. "My daughters will stay here with you." The idea startled her. You trust me with them?" Shadowhawk met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "They already trust you," he said. "They slept in your arms longer than they have since their mother passed." Clara felt her breath catch. She looked down at the tiny faces peeking from the woven cradle. A soft cry rose from one of them. "Little Moon." Shadowhawk had called her. Without thinking, Clara reached out and touched the baby's cheek. The crying stopped instantly, just like that. As if the child recognized her, a murmur rippled through a few of the watching women. Even the elder blinked in surprise. "Feed them," Shadowhawk said gently. "I will return once you are settled." He stepped back. but not before giving Clara a brief nod, one that spoke of gratitude, respect, and something quieter that she could not yet name. Inside the teepee, Clara sank onto a soft bed of furs. She held the twins close, their warmth seeping into her tired body. They rooted instantly, hungry, trusting her without question. As they fed, Clara felt a strange calm settling over her. These babies, orphans, fragile and innocent, looked up at her with eyes so pure it made her chest ache. She had lost everything, yet now she held something new, something precious. When the twins drifted to sleep, curled against her like tiny creatures seeking shelter, Clara looked around the dim lodge and whispered to herself, "I can do this." For the first time since Everett's death, she felt purpose rippling back into her veins. Outside, the Apache continued to watch her with mixed suspicion and curiosity. Inside, two infants had already decided. They had chosen her. The days that followed were unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. The Apache camp moved with a rhythm she could scarcely understand, a rhythm tied to the sun, the wind, and the shifting sands of the desert. Men returned from hunting expeditions with game over their shoulders. Women prepared meals over open fires, and children ran barefoot across the dust, laughing and shrieking. Clara, once a widow lost and wandering, found herself at the center of it all, carrying the weight of two tiny lives in her arms. It was not easy. The tribe's curiosity had not yet become trust. Every glance she received seemed to weigh her worth. Every whispered exchange behind her back hinted at judgment. Clara quickly realized she would have to prove herself, not only to Shadowhawk, the man who had brought her here, but to the entire community that had survived by relying on strength, skill, and loyalty. She had no weapon, no authority, no knowledge of their ways, only her hands, her voice, and her devotion to the twins. From sunrise until the first stars blinked in the desert sky, Clara attended to the babies. She fed them, cleaned them, and soothed them when they cried. She hummed soft lullabies she had learned from her own mother, songs of rivers, mountains, and home. Often, when the babies were asleep, she stitched tiny garments from scraps of cloth, sewing in secret while the tribe observed from a distance. It was exhausting work, yet each smile, each coo from the twins, gave her more strength than any food or rest could. The first test of her patience came when the medicine woman, a stern figure who bore the authority of generations, stepped into her teepee unannounced. Clara jumped slightly, heart pounding, and the woman's eyes narrowed. She held a small bundle of herbs, and with one precise motion, she began rubbing a paste onto the baby's tiny skin. Clara watched silently, unsure whether to intervene. The medicine woman spoke no word, only gestured sharply, indicating that Clara should assist. Her hand shook as she helped, but she obeyed. That day, for the first time, a woman of the tribe had touched her shoulders with approval. Other trials followed. Children tested her patience, tugging at her skirts and babbling in a language she did not understand. She learned to respond with gentle tones and small gestures, mimicking what she saw the Apache mothers do. Slowly, laughter replaced suspicion. The younger children began following her, drawn by the warmth she offered. At first, the women watched, whispering to each other. Then, some began to nod as she passed, a small sign of acceptance. A few even came to help her with chores, showing her how to prepare traditional meals or weave mats from reeds. Through it all, Shadowhawk watched quietly, always at a distance. He never interfered, but his gaze often lingered longer than necessary, observing how she interacted with his daughters and the rest of the tribe. Sometimes, when she caught his eyes, she felt a strange shiver as though he could see every fear, every doubt, every sorrow she had carried through the desert. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Clara began to notice subtle changes in the way the camp treated her. When she walked through the central fire circle, people stepped aside without speaking, offering her a place to sit or a portion of food. Children ran to her when they fell, knowing she would comfort them. Even the dogs of the tribe accepted her presence, curling near her when the twins rested. Each small act of recognition, each fleeting smile, slowly transformed her from outsider to someone who belonged. The twins themselves had become anchors of this fragile bond. Quiet Sparrow and Little Moon, once frightened and unsettled, now thrived under Clara's care. They laughed in her arms, reaching for her face, their tiny fingers gripping her hair or hands with fierce determination. Even the most skeptical of Apache women would glance at the babies and then at Clara. Realizing that the infant's joy was inseparable from her devotion died by the end of the third week, Clara had begun to sense it, a silent acknowledgement from the tribe that she had earned a place among them. She could feel their eyes watching less critically and more kindly. Shadowhawk's nods, subtle but frequent, confirmed that her efforts had not gone unnoticed. For Clara Hayes, the desert widow who had wandered alone, lost and heartbroken, life had begun to offer a fragile promise, a chance not only to survive but to belong, to protect, and perhaps even to love in a place she had never imagined calling home. The desert is merciless, and Clara Hayes soon learned that even the strongest bond can be tested by the land itself. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, the sky darkened with a sudden fury. Clouds churned and roared across the horizon, an unusual storm for this arid territory. Winds whipped the camp into a frenzy, sending dust, sand, and debris through every corner. The fires at the center of the village flared and sputtered. Animals scattered. Children cried. The twin daughters, Quiet Sparrow and Little Moon, clung to Clara, their small bodies trembling against her chest. Clara had never seen a storm like this, not even in the wildest months back east. The wind screamed in her ears, rattling the teepees and threatening to sweep everything away. With no time to think, she gathered the twins in her arms and dashed toward a low rock formation near the edge of the camp, the only place that might provide even a semblance of shelter. The tribe shouted warnings and directions behind her, but the words were nearly lost in the roar of the storm. Inside the rocky alcove, Clara pressed herself against the stone, holding the babies close, feeling their rapid heartbeats against her chest. She wrapped a blanket around them, clutching it tight against the wind. Sand stung her face, tears mingling with grit, but she barely noticed. All that mattered was the fragile warmth in her arms, the tiny lives she was charged with protecting. Her body ached from exhaustion, from fear, from the relentless strain of holding the infants as the storm battered the landscape. Hours seemed to pass like days. The sound of the wind, the relentless whine of sand and dust, the occasional crack of lightning that split the sky, all pressed upon Clara, threatening to crush her resolve. Yet she refused to let panic take hold. She whispered softly to the twins, stories she barely remembered from her own childhood, stories of rivers, mountains, and stars that never moved. She hummed lullabies she thought the storm could not hear, songs that spoke of comfort, home, and safety. Each note, each word, became a lifeline not just for the babies, but for herself. When the storm finally began to subside, Clara realized she had not moved from her position. Her hair clung to her forehead, her clothes were soaked and covered in sand, and her hands were raw from clutching the blanket. But the twins were safe, sleeping peacefully, trusting her entirely. Relief washed over her in a wave stronger than any she had felt in months. She dared to breathe, daring to hope that she had survived the storm with her charges intact. It was then that Shadowhawk appeared. He had been out in the storm as well, moving among his people, ensuring that no one else had been lost or harmed. His clothes were torn, his hair dusted with sand, his expression both relieved and tinged with worry. When he saw Clara huddled with the twins, He dropped to his knees beside her without hesitation, inspecting the babies carefully, his hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted each one to check for scratches or bruises. Clara watched him silently, a lump forming in her throat. Realizing that he had risked himself to make sure they were all safe. "You have done well," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the evidence of fatigue in his posture. "You protected them when I could not be here." Clara looked up at him, exhaustion making her words tremble. They needed me," she whispered. "I could not let anything happen to them." Shadowhawk's dark eyes softened, and he did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back against the rock, watching her with an intensity that made Clara's stomach tighten. In that gaze, she sensed respect, acknowledgement, and something she could not yet name, a connection forged in shared danger and shared care. The twins stirred, awakening to the warmth of their protector and the looming figure of their father. They blinked sleepily, their tiny hands reaching out for Clara first, and then cautiously toward Shadowhawk. The simple gesture, the recognition of trust and love, created a silence that held more meaning than words ever could. Clara realized then that the bond she had formed with the tribe, with the twins and even with Shadowhawk, was no longer fragile. It had been tested by fire, storm, and fear, and it had endured. That night, as the wind finally died and the desert returned to its quiet vigil, Clara held the twins close in her arms while Shadowhawk watched over her, and she felt, for the first time in months, a sense of home settle quietly into her soul. By the time the desert sun rose each morning, Clara Hayes had become inseparable from Quiet, Sparrow, and Little Moon. The twins had survived their first weeks in the Apache camp, fragile yet growing stronger under her constant care. Every morning, they reached for her before anyone else, their tiny fingers curling into her hair or grasping her hand as if claiming her as their own. Clara watched in awe as the bond deepened, the twins' dependence on her more than she could have imagined. She had started as a stranger, a visitor from another world. But now she was the center of their tiny universe. The tribe noticed, as they could not help but notice everything that touched the lives of their children. At first, the whispers had been cautious, skeptical, and sometimes judgmental. "Will she endure?" some women had murmured. "Will she care for our little ones as her own?" But as days turned into weeks, those whispers shifted. The children's joy, their laughter, their reliance on Clara spoke louder than any words could. Even the elders began to nod when they saw her, a subtle acknowledgement that she had earned a place in their midst, that the twins' preference for her was unmistakable. When other women approached to hold them, Quiet Sparrow and Little Moon squirmed, reaching instead for Clara, their tiny arms wrapped around her neck, their soft cries calling only to her. It was not simply hunger they sought to satisfy, but comfort, safety, and love. Clara felt her chest swell with a mixture of pride and tenderness, the quiet thrill of knowing she had become indispensable to these delicate lives. She was no longer merely their caretaker, she was their mother in every sense that mattered to them. Clara herself had begun to transform. The grief she had carried for months, the ache left by her late husband, was slowly being replaced with purpose. Caring for the twins gave her a reason to rise with the sun, to endure the hardships of desert life, to learn the ways of the tribe. She began helping with other chores, guided by the women who had once observed her with suspicion. She learned to gather firewood, to prepare simple meals over open flames, and to sew not only for the babies but for the community. Every act, every lesson, became a bridge connecting her to this new world. Shadowhawk watched all of this quietly. His presence was constant but unobtrusive, a silent sentinel observing the growing bond between Clara and his daughters. Occasionally, he would approach, offering a nod or a word of acknowledgement, a rare smile brushing his face. Clara began to notice subtle changes in their interactions, a lingering glance, a hand that brushed hers when handing her a blanket, a quiet conversation about the babies when no one else was around. She did not yet understand the depth of his feelings, but she sensed them. A warmth beneath his stoic exterior that mirrored her own growing attachment. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, Clara sat outside the teepee with the twins in her lap. Quiet Sparrow reached up to trace the lines of her face with tiny fingers, while Little Moon nuzzled against her neck. The babies giggled softly, delighted by the gentle rocking of Clara's arms. Nearby, other children of the tribe played, occasionally glancing at her with curiosity and acceptance. She realized with a pang of emotion that the tribe was no longer watching her with doubt, they were watching her with trust. Witnessing the way she loved their most precious treasures, the twins' choice was clear and undeniable. They did not merely accept her, they claimed her. Their devotion was pure, unwavering, and immediate. Clara, in turn, felt a love that had been absent from her life since the death of her husband, a love that was complicated, fierce, and yet tender. She understood that she could not imagine leaving them, could not imagine a life where she did not hear their laughter each morning, where she did not feel their tiny hands gripping hers in trust. Shadowhawk approached as the night settled in, kneeling beside her without breaking the rhythm of her care. He observed the twins, watching their eyes follow Clara's movements. Then he looked at her, his dark gaze calm yet intense. "They are yours," he said quietly, a statement of acknowledgement, not question. "You have earned their hearts." Clara felt her throat tighten, words caught in her chest. She nodded, unable to speak, letting her gaze sweep over the tiny faces sleeping peacefully in her arms. She had arrived in the desert as a widow, lost and alone. Now in this harsh and unforgiving land, she had found purpose, trust, and a love she had never expected both from the twins and, quietly, from the man who had brought her here that night. Clara slept lightly, the twins nestled against her chest, their warmth radiating through her. She understood, more fully than ever, that the bond they shared was unbreakable. The twins had chosen her, and in doing so, they had given her a gift she could never have anticipated, a family reborn from loss, a place in a world she had never known, and the beginning of a life worth living again. Life in the Apache camp had settled into a rhythm that Clara Hayes had come to cherish. Each day brought small victories, the twins laughing in her arms, the tribe nodding in recognition of her efforts, and the quiet moments when Shadowhawk's presence reminded her that she was no longer alone. Yet the desert, while beautiful, was never truly safe. Clara had learned that even in a place where trust had begun to grow, danger could arrive suddenly, unannounced. And inescapable. It was late afternoon when the first signs appeared, dust rising on the horizon, a flicker of movement in the distance, and the faint sound of hoofbeats pounding across the arid plain. Clara was inside the teepee, rocking the twins to sleep after a long day of feeding and sewing, when she heard the faint but distinct alarm calls from the camp sentries. Her heart leaped into her throat. Shadowhawk's voice, calm but sharp, cut through the sudden tension. "Clara, stay with the children." Outside, a group of men rode toward the camp, their uniforms ragged, rifles slung across their shoulders. They were soldiers or perhaps renegades intent on capturing her, convinced that a white woman could not have arrived at the Apache camp by choice. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust as they drew closer, and Clara could see the determination in their eyes. They were looking for a prize, not understanding the bonds that had been forged in this unforgiving land. Clara held the twins closer, her pulse pounding. She whispered softly to them, trying to keep their tiny bodies calm even as her own fears surged. "It's all right, darlings. Mama is here. Mama will protect you." Her voice wavered, but she tried to instill in them a sense of safety that belied the chaos outside. Shadowhawk had gathered his warriors swiftly. There was no hesitation in his commands, only the precise movements of men and women trained to defend their home. Arrows were notched, horses guided into strategic positions, and scouts circled the approaching threat. Clara could see the intensity on Shadowhawk's face, the leader, the father, the protector of his people, and it stirred something deep within her. The intruders were relentless, demanding Clara's presence, believing she had been forced into the tribe against her will. "Step forward, woman," one of them shouted, his rifle leveled in her direction. "You don't belong here." Clara's stomach twisted. She wanted to shout that she was safe, that she was not a prisoner, but the words caught in her throat. She could not risk the twins. She could not risk the camp. All she could do was clutch them tighter and pray. Arrows sliced through the air, clashing against rifles in a tense exchange of fire. The renegades had underestimated the precision and courage of Shadowhawk's warriors. Chaos erupted, dust and smoke mingling in a haze that made Clara's chest tighten with fear. She stayed low in the teepee, protecting the twins, covering their tiny forms with her body as the sounds of battle rattled the walls at the height of the skirmish. Shadowhawk appeared inside the teepee, his clothing torn, a gash forming on his shoulder. Blood matted his hair, but his eyes dark and fierce locked onto Clara. "They will not touch you or the girls," he said, voice steady despite the pain. "Trust me." Clara could only nod, tears streaking her face as she felt the full weight of the bond that had been forming for weeks. She was not alone. She had never truly been alone since arriving in this camp. The twins squirmed, sensing the tension, and Clara whispered encouragements, letting them feel her courage even when her own trembled. The skirmish ended as suddenly as it began. The renegades, outmaneuvered and outmatched, retreated across the plains. Silence fell over the camp, broken only by the heavy breathing of the warriors and the soft cries of relieved children. Shadowhawk collapsed against a rock, the gash on his shoulder stark against his dark skin. Clara rushed to him, tending to the wound with whatever supplies she could find. The twins safe at her side in that moment, as she pressed cloth to his injury and whispered reassurances. Clara realized the depth of what she had gained in the tribe. She was no longer merely a caretaker. She was part of a family that would fight, bleed, and risk everything for one another. The twins had chosen her, the tribe had accepted her, and Shadowhawk, wounded, fierce, and unwavering, had proven that her place here was undeniable. Clara felt an unfamiliar surge of determination. Danger could come from anywhere, but she would face it all if it meant keeping her daughters safe. And in that desert wilderness, among the winds, the dust, and the unforgiving land, she knew she had found a home worth defending at any cost. The desert air was cool that night, a rare relief after the chaos of the skirmish that had tested every ounce of courage within Clara Hayes. The camp was quiet, the fires reduced to low embers that flickered softly against the darkened horizon. Clara sat outside the teepee, Quiet Sparrow and Little Moon sleeping peacefully in a woven cradle beside her, their tiny chests rising and falling with delicate rhythm. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe, to reflect on the whirlwind of events that had brought her here and shaped her new life. She thought of her journey across the barren terrain, of the moment she had first met Shadowhawk, and of the storm that had tested her and the twins. She thought of the tribe, their skeptical eyes, their whispered questions, and the gradual transformation of doubt into cautious trust. She thought of the way the twins had grown to recognize her as the center of their world, their tiny hands reaching for her before anyone else. And she realized with a sudden undeniable clarity that leaving was no longer an option. It had not been a single moment that brought her to this realization. It had been a series of quiet, persistent truths that had settled deep within her heart. She could not imagine walking away from the laughter of the twins, from the warmth of the tribe that had slowly accepted her as one of their own. She could not imagine the emptiness she would feel if she were forced to leave Shadowhawk, whose steady presence had become a silent reassurance she had not anticipated. A connection she could not ignore. Shadowhawk appeared as if sensing her thoughts, stepping lightly across the sand to sit beside her. His shoulder, still bearing the mark of the wound he had sustained in the earlier attack, was straightened with quiet pride, his eyes scanning the camp with the vigilance of a protector. He said nothing at first, merely observing the peaceful scene, the twins sleeping without fear, the children playing quietly nearby. Clara felt the weight of his gaze on her, steady, patient, and yet charged with something more than mere observation. "You have done well," he said finally, his voice low, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command, yet softened by respect. "They are thriving because of you." Clara shook her head gently, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It is not just me," she said. "It is them. They have given me purpose, and I think I have given them something in return." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes revealing nothing at first, then a subtle warmth that she could not deny. "You are more than a caretaker," he said quietly. "You are part of this family. You belong here." Clara felt her heart tighten. She had imagined many endings for her life, some full of grief, others of quiet survival, but she had never imagined this, that she would come to the desert, a widow lost and alone, and find a place where she was needed, loved, and respected. The twins had chosen her, the tribe had accepted her, and now Shadowhawk's acknowledgement confirmed what she had feared to hope, that her place was here. She reached out and touched the girl's tiny hands, fingers curling around hers instinctively. "I could never leave them," she whispered, almost to herself. The words carried a weight of truth she could not deny. The desert, harsh and unforgiving, had become a home through their trust and love. Shadowhawk shifted slightly, sitting closer, though still careful to respect the space between them. "Then stay," he said simply. "For them. For yourself, stay." Clara looked into his eyes and saw the depth of his sincerity. In that moment, she understood the unspoken bond that had been forming between them, the quiet respect, the shared hardships, the mutual care that had grown stronger through the weeks. There was a promise there, unspoken yet undeniable, that neither time nor distance could break. She nodded, a small, resolute gesture that felt heavier than any decision she had made before. "I will stay," she said. "I belong here. With them. With all of you." The camp was quiet, but the unspoken acknowledgement hung in the air, heavier than any words. The twins stirred slightly, as if sensing the shift in her heart, their tiny hands reaching for her instinctively. Clara held them closer, feeling their warmth, their trust, and the undeniable truth that she had finally found a place she could call home that night. As the stars glittered over the desert sky, Clara Hayes understood something she had never known before. Family was not defined solely by blood, but by love, loyalty, and the courage to protect those who could not protect themselves. And in this remote corner of the world, with two small daughters in her arms and a warrior by her side, she had discovered the meaning of belonging at last. Morning arrived over the Tintin Covey, Apache camp like a slow brush of gold against the horizon. The desert, silent and expansive, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that a transformation had taken place within its midst. Clara Hayes woke to the soft stirring of quiet sparrow and little moon, their tiny fingers reaching instinctively for her, tugging at the blankets as they demanded warmth, comfort, and love. She smiled, the familiar ache of exhaustion replaced by the quiet joy of belonging. In their hands, she had found purpose. In their eyes, she had found home. Today was the day her moon of service would end. The day she might have been expected to leave. The thought weighed heavily on her chest as she stepped outside, the warm sun illuminating the camp she had come to know so well. The tribe was already stirring. Warriors tended their mounts and checked equipment. Women prepared the morning meals, and children played under the watchful eyes of their elders. But something was different this morning. Clara noticed a stillness, a subtle shift in the air. The tribe had gathered near the central fire circle, their expressions unreadable but filled with anticipation. Shadowhawk approached, his dark eyes steady on hers. There was no need for ceremony or speech. His presence alone spoke volumes. He had watched her, tested her patience, and observed the bond she had formed with his daughters. Today he was here not as a chief commanding a subject, but as a man acknowledging what had already been earned: trust, love, and an undeniable place within his people. The twins stirred, sensing the gathering. Quiet Sparrow let out a soft squeal and reached for Clara, and Little Moon followed suit, clinging to her skirts. Clara's heart swelled as she held them close, their tiny bodies pressing against hers as if demanding that she never leave. At that moment, she understood fully that leaving was impossible. The bonds she had formed were stronger than fear, stronger than doubt, stronger than any expectation the desert or the tribe could impose. The elders stepped forward. One by one, their faces solemn yet approving. They nodded toward Clara, acknowledging her place among them. The women who had once watched her suspiciously smiled faintly, some even approaching to offer assistance or share words of encouragement. Children ran forward to touch her hands, their small voices filled with delight and familiarity. Clara's pulse quickened. Every gesture, every glance confirmed what she already knew in her heart: she was no longer an outsider. She belonged. Shadowhawk finally spoke, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs of the gathering. "Clara Hayes," he said, measured and deliberate, "you have cared for my daughters as your own. You have protected them, guided them, and loved them. You have earned your place in this tribe and in our hearts." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "If you wish, you may stay here forever. The choice is yours and yours alone." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, the reality of the moment overwhelming. She looked down at the twins, their trusting faces gazing up at her, and at the tribe who had become her family. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the girls into her arms, holding them close. "I will stay," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I belong here. With them. With all of you." A cheer rose from the gathered tribe, a mixture of approval, relief, and celebration. Children clapped and danced around her, women embraced her gently, and men gave respectful nods of recognition. Shadowhawk approached and placed a hand over hers, his dark eyes softening in a rare and unguarded expression of affection. No words were needed. The silent promise in that touch spoke louder than any speech could. The day passed in quiet celebration, not with extravagant feasts or loud proclamations, but with the gentle rhythms of life in the desert. Clara learned more of the tribe's customs, shared small laughs with the children, and watched Shadowhawk interact with his people. For the first time in months, she felt a deep, steady peace. She was no longer a wandering widow. She was a mother, a protector, and a part of a family that had opened their hearts to her without hesitation as the sun dipped behind the distant mesas. Painting the sky with shades of crimson and gold, Clara held the twins close. Shadowhawk stood beside her, his presence a steady, comforting weight. Around them, the camp settled into the quiet night, the desert breathing its ancient rhythm. Clara Hayes had arrived in the Apache Nation as a woman with nothing but grief, uncertainty, and fear. She had found instead love, purpose, and belonging in the heart of the desert, among warriors, women, children, and the endless horizon. Clara understood the truth she had been searching for. Family is not only born of blood, but of trust, courage, and love. And here, with Quiet Sparrow and Little Moon in her arms, and Shadowhawk beside her, she had found a family that would endure all trials, a home that would withstand every storm, and a life filled with the warmth and devotion.